This is Metro Week. Our top story, the future of transportation in Tucson. We'll find out how experts think the state should find new sources of funding for roads. Then we'll ask a state lawmaker for a reality check on raising taxes for roads. Plus, our Journalists Roundtable analyzes the week's news.
Welcome to Metro Week. I'm Andrea Kelly. Transportation funding is a problem in Arizona. The taxes we pay that are supposed to go to roads don't always get spent that way. And when they do, they're often not enough. This week, we're looking at long-term transportation planning. Some of the taxes we pay for roads, such as the gasoline tax, have not kept up with inflation or with wear and tear on the roads for a long time. That means any conversation about what we want in our transportation future also has to include an eye on what's been happening. Take PIMA County, for example. Crews maintain more than 2,000 miles of streets and roads. Some are new or have recently been expanded with Regional Transportation Authority funding, and those are in pretty good condition. But a lot of roads are not so nice to drive on. The county's budget can't keep up. Transportation officials say it would take $300 million to bring all roads into good condition. That's a lot when you consider this. The entire road maintenance budget in PIMA County for 1 year is less than $30 million, and that has to cover all kinds of things that do not improve the condition of the streets we drive on. Tucson's road budget is less than $23 million this year, and the city would need more than $600 million to bring all of its streets up to good or excellent condition. This week, I interviewed Hal Ashton of the Ashton Company. That's a roadwork contractor that has done projects for the city, county, and state. He attended a statewide town hall on transportation issues last week in Tucson. You were at an Arizona town hall on transportation last week. What did the group of you, the people who were at that town hall, talk about as the future for the transportation industry or for transportation for us drivers?
In this particular time in history that we're in right now, the primary subject is in this somewhat declining and depressed economy. How do you fund this kind of work? People still drive, the roads are still failing. How do we fund it? And there are several ways of funding it. One thing that makes me a little bit unhappy is, from the political standpoint, it seems like if you want to be elected, if you want to become the governor of Arizona, as an example, and I like Governor Ducey very much, but you say no new taxes. Well, if you say no new taxes, then if you need more money, where does it come from? So there are several areas that we studied. I mean, you can look at gasoline tax. You can look at the tax that you pay when you buy your license plates. You can bond, and those things have been very successful. The half cent in Phoenix has created most of the freeways in Phoenix.
Did the town hall come up with a consensus on what funding source would be best for the future?
The town hall came up with a consensus that we really need to develop a blue ribbon commission, you could say, of experts on just how to do this. And that's one thing that again, I find a little bit frustrating with town hall, is that they have usually 2 a year. So this is transportation, and 6 months from now they do water. And how do we get enough out of the transportation town hall that we just had to move something forward? I mean, we can say, yes, we think that we should do this, but the people that were sitting in those committees are not the people that are going to do the work.
Who is going to do it? Who do you advise creates this commission?
I think it's up to the governor and the legislature to actually develop some blue ribbon commissions of people, gather experts together, and have those people work on how are we going to resolve these problems. The problem is here. How are we going to solve it, and how are we going to prioritize it and move it forward?
And for more on the politics and policy of planning for Arizona's transportation future, I turn to State Senator Steve Farley. He represents Midtown Tucson and has long been involved in transportation issues, advocating years ago for voters to fund road work with a sales tax and encouraging alternative modes of travel. Senator Farley, you were also at the town hall, and we heard Hal Ashton say that one of the consensus points was a blue ribbon commission to talk about the future of transportation. What else came out of that town hall?
Well, I was surprised at how much consensus there was on pretty much everything we agreed on. Number one, while it would seem like something not everyone would agree on, everyone said from the beginning, we need to increase the gas tax now, and we need to index it, because it has not been increased since 1990. It's been 18 cents a gallon ever since then, and the buying power of 18 cents over the last 25 years have gone down considerably, as well as people are getting higher mileage vehicles, so they're buying less gas now. So we're getting a lot less to take care of the roads we've already built, and we need to do something to stop the bleeding right away. And everyone in that town hall agreed that that's something we need to do.
Now you're in the state legislature, which is how a gas tax would have to be increased, is through the state. What's the political viability of raising it?
Well, it's always challenging to get any taxes increased through this legislature. But if you look at the Utah legislature, on March 15th, they had a 24-cent a gallon gas tax. They voted to eliminate that and replace it with a 12% gas tax, with a floor of 29 cents a gallon and a ceiling of 40 cents a gallon that it would bounce in between those depending on the price of gas. They additionally allowed cities and counties to institute their own quarter-cent sales tax for transit projects. So if you can do that in a very red state like Utah, there's no reason we can't be doing it here, particularly because the future of our transportation system depends on it, and with that, the future of our economy.
Now, would that be enough funding to catch up on some of the past needs and keep up with the future needs on transportation infrastructure work?
We're way, way behind. There's now a plan to actually keep us economically competitive that would be $20 billion over the next 20 years. We're only,
that was million or billion?
Billion.
Okay.
That's $1 billion a year that we need to spend to really stay competitive. Sadly, we're only spending $25 million a year now on new capacity for our roadways. That's not enough for us to stay competitive with our neighboring states like New Mexico, Texas, or California.
Now, we also pay other taxes to cover our transportation needs. Are those part of the potential long-term solution, maybe raising the licensing fees when we register a vehicle and get our license?
Well, that's an important point. The gas tax is not going to last forever. More people are driving electric-fueled cars, natural gas-fueled cars. There may be actually fuel cell-powered cars, and people are moving away from gasoline in general. So we can't tie our future of transportation spending to a fuel source. We should make it fuel agnostic, I call it. It doesn't matter what fuel you use, we need to figure out a way that the funding source will not be tied to the fuel. And that means that we should be looking at things like potentially a vehicle miles traveled fee, where you get charged per how many miles you travel. We may look at a different kind of VLT, vehicle license tax, depending on the weight of the car, to a rough equivalent of how much damage it does to the pavement. We could be looking at a whole lot of other sources, and there are at least over half the country's states have already done something to deal with transportation funding. We're kind of behind the 8 ball on this one, and we should be moving forward to look at a more sustainable long-term funding source, as well as increasing the gas tax right now.
We've seen local jurisdictions take some of these other options into consideration. 9 years ago, you were one of the biggest proponents for the Regional Transportation Authority, which voters approved in 2006 and is a 20-year plan to fund road work with a sales tax in PIMA County. We've seen voters approve bonding in the city of Tucson, which is a property tax loan essentially to pay for roads. As a state lawmaker, are you seeing more and more communities choosing to figure out how to fund these things themselves when the state isn't figuring out the problems?
They certainly are, and there's more states figuring this out because the federal government isn't doing their job either. So it keeps going downhill until you get to the level of government that's directly responsible for it, and then if no one's helping up at the other levels, you've got to do it yourself. And I think those examples you show prove that voters, when asked for a specific package of transportation improvements and a specific type of funding source, we'll vote yes if the community comes together on this. That's absolutely crucial to know. There shouldn't be this fear of finding a sustainable funding source from our legislators, because voters will back you up if you're collecting something for a specific purpose that they see as valuable. And I think everybody sees transportation as valuable to our economy and to our everyday lives.
Do you think that we're looking at a future where we aren't relying on the state and the federal government? This becomes more common for local governments to figure out how to make roads work, whether it's expanding them or just keeping them in good shape?
And sad as that is to say, I think as our national government seems to be unable to get past its gridlock on any topic, especially anything related to transportation funding, and as our state government decides that it doesn't want to stand up and show leadership on something this important to our economy, then we have to do it ourselves at a local level. They're just leaving us no option. That's not necessarily the way it should be, but it seems to be the way it's working out. And I think we've proven in PIMA County that we can take our future into our own hands. So that's why I've introduced bills such as a bill allowing each county to institute its own gas tax at wholesale. So if we decide we want to do it and keep our money here, we can do that.
Now, would that proposal be based on the amount of the gallon of fuel bought or the price of fuel?
That would be a percentage on the price of fuel, so it would go up with the price of fuel. So we wouldn't end up losing our value for inflation to make that happen. So
you're saying that matches the Utah model?
It matches the Utah model, the way that would work. Because I think that's important. And I have gotten support from certain Republicans in the legislature to say that they are interested in that Utah model. And they haven't done anything this year, but I think there are some people at certain levels kicking it around, even within the Republicans in the legislature and even in the governor's office.
Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Governor Doug Ducey is in southern Arizona this week to talk education and business.
I know our budget will require other leaders in our local communities, schools, and universities to also make their own decisions. And in many cases, they also may not be popular.
Now our Journalist Roundtable. Joining me in the studio this week are my colleagues Zach Ziegler of Arizona Public Media, Thelma Grimes of Tucson Local Media, and Dylan Smith of the Tucson Sentinel. Thank you all for coming in. Dylan, I want to start with you, just get a little reaction to something that Senator Farley said, which was that if Utah can raise a gas tax and make it more like a sales tax on gas, then certainly Arizona could do the same thing. Is he being realistic, or is he overly optimistic about what could happen in the state legislature?
Well, given what the legislature's been doing so far this year with their budget, with basically passing so many costs down to the local level, down to cities and counties, I really don't see this legislature voting to increase taxes. That doesn't seem to be what they think they were elected to do. If there were an initiative, if the people really spoke up and got that on the ballot and voted for it, I think that would be, that's always difficult to do, but that's probably a more realistic route than expecting the legislature to pick up that and run with it.
It's been pretty clear, no new taxes message from our legislature. Now, Zach, you've been covering some long-term transportation planning for us here at Arizona Public Media. What can you tell us about how detailed those plans are with funding? We're planning for projects and what we need to put cars on the road, but do we have funding sources?
As far as the interstate system and the larger state level highways, the major projects are all, at least in southern Arizona, in the phase of studies and reports at this point. And those are relatively less expensive when you're talking about building a major road. So they've been able to come through with funding on those, but when it comes to these long-term projects, the hundreds of millions of dollars that would be needed, even piling into the billions possibly, to build some of the major interstate highway projects are talking about, they haven't necessarily identified a lot of that funding source.
One thing I found interesting in the interview was he brought up that, we're way behind New Mexico, California, all these other states, and we've gone that way over the years. Do we just drop the ball in continuing to fund this? Did we just not have the money? How did we get to this level?
Well, and that's one thing actually, even with Interstate 11, we are seeing funding coming through on that, on Nevada's end of things. They've already started trying to find the funds to build, even the short length that they will be building in that initial stretch that runs from Phoenix to Las Vegas. They're already getting their funding for that little bit that's in their state. So maybe it is a bit of dropping the ball. Maybe there's a little hope that, this is an interstate. Maybe a lot of federal funds will be coming towards this project. Who knows? But right now, I think it's just we're going to take it one step at a time and let the funding be addressed when we finally get everything approved.
Sort of a philosophy of if we don't have the plans, we can't get the funding anyway, so we might as well make the plans.
Yeah. It just baby steps, slowly take the process.
All right, and Thelma, we heard in those interviews something we've heard before, which is that everything drives back to economic development. If we don't have the roads, we're not going to attract companies and businesses to move here and contribute to economic development, which also in the end leads to more taxes for the state economy. Is there anything new here?
No, I think we keep hearing the same thing. We want roads, we want infrastructure, we need all of that to get the businesses to come here. But then at the state level and also at the local level, you hear no new taxes because we don't want to drive them away. But then we need the taxes to pay for this. So I think it's just a circle that keeps kind of going.
And what have we been hearing from sort of the groups that are trying to attract the businesses to move here or to grow here? Are they working on any transportation initiatives?
Not that I know, but the main thing we do keep hearing is the roads, and it needs to improve in this area.
Dylan, I'd like to ask for an update on a specific road. We reported a few weeks ago that the city of Tucson's bond program to fix up the roads was ahead of schedule, had some extra money left over, was going to repave Grant Road, which wasn't in the original plan, and then that got a setback. So update us on what's been happening on Grant Road.
Well, the Grant Road funding is actually not through the city's road bond. It's coming from PAG, the PIMA Association of Governments. The RTA, basically, is funding that portion of it. The city is been coming in really thus far about 40% under budget. That's what they're projecting for the whole 5-year term of the road bond. So they added about 45 new stretches of street to that they're going to repave. But there was a bit of a snag in the Grant project, that 3-mile stretch in Midtown that had gotten just awful. And about a mile of that, when they started ripping up the road, milling it to repave it, they ran into what's called petromat, which is kind of like roofing felt that they use to reinforce when they do an overlay job. And there were a couple layers of that made it impossible for them to use the process that they set out to do. So that project is going over budget a little bit. It was budgeted at $1.7 million, and it's going to cost about another $500,000 to do this, which is kind of a stopgap measure that's supposed to last, the next 8 or 10 years until they widen that stretch.
Did this change the time frame on how they're going to get it done and how long it's going to take now?
Probably added a couple of weeks to the project. It wasn't a huge setback in timing. It was scheduling people to and equipment to come do the different sort of process. But that was basically the hiccup there. And overall, not a huge amount of money, but for that one project, it's a pretty significant cost overrun.
That's one of the roads that was a big deal in the regional transportation plan, that road needed to be completely overhauled, and it's still several years away, which is why that repaving is still important
That's
now.
why they were trying to put off working on that portion of the road, because it's going to be widened, repaved, completely redone. But that portion is about, at this point, at least 6, more like 8 or 10 years off the widening portion, running right through Midtown there.
So it's a kind of expensive but stopgap measure.
Yeah, but it had gotten so terrible, they had to do something with it.
All right, well, switching topics just a little bit, I want to ask you about the county budget, because County Administrator Chuck Huckleberry just released his proposal this week. We're going to touch on it more in next week's show, but just, Dylan, if you could give us a quick summary of what that budget proposal says.
Very quick, considering it's, about 9,000 pages long. Something, was it 640 pages? It's enormous. The brief memo running down the budget is 33 pages. So it's a pretty dense document. I can't claim to have read every single page of it yet. But the county budget is projected to, if this passes, it'll go down a little bit next year, about $20 million less than it was last year. But because of the way that the state is cutting its support for certain things, roads and many other things, and pushing those responsibilities down onto the county, they're asking for a fairly significant tax increase in property taxes that'll add, between the county, the library district, and the flood control district, about $50 or $60 to a homeowner's tax tab every year.
And that we'll need a final vote from the County Board of Supervisors, which isn't coming until sometime in June. So like I said, we'll talk about it in a little more detail.
They're asking for feedback right now on the county's website. If you want to weigh in, they're they want people to hear from people and get their input.
They also have a public hearing on May 12th, correct?
They've got several between now and when they take that final vote. Another county issue, Thelma, is the bond program that the supervisors approved putting on the November ballot. And I know you've been working and your staff has been working on some follow-up and some updates about how the Marana and Oro Valley area elected officials feel about this, putting some questions on the ballot to ask if people want to fund a loan to do construction work. So what did you find when you talked to those officials?
I found that interesting this week. First we called Marana, because you remember Marana, Oro Valley, Vail, all these areas outside, outside the main Tucson area have to also be a part of this. So talking to Mayor Ed Honey from Marana, he was clear on, I don't support it, I don't trust the county, and I don't see how it really helps us.
What sort of is the background for those positions?
It's interesting when it comes to Marana and the PIMA County, that long existing argument over wastewater and who has the right to handle it. So that dates back to, 2008 or even before. Marana eventually took over wastewater, but in that time there was also a bond that said that the county was supposed to take care of some wastewater and sewer line issues in Honey Heights. However, when Marana, through the courts and through agreements, took over their own wastewater facility, Chuck Huckleberry, the Pima County administrator, said, well, legally, we could no longer do that project. Mayor Honey disagrees and said they just didn't do the project because they were mad over the litigation. So there's trust issues on that level. But Mayor Honey also says he doesn't feel Pima County is being managed very well, and he thinks instead of adding $800 million in bonds and 12 years of debt, they could look at being a little more efficient.
And we've seen in past bond elections that there is some concern for the outer lying areas that they're going to pay property taxes to fund these programs, but then they're not going to get as much benefit. Did you hear any of that in those interviews?
When you talked to Councilman Will Gardner in Oro Valley, he brought up a few key points where the council did vote to support the $30 million in projects that are in the bond package, but they did it well before the county decided how they were going to handle how it's going to go on a ballot. So they supported it, but now the questions are in 7 different areas, and those packages the council approved is also aligned differently. So he says he feels voters are going to be confused. He says the road package really doesn't help Oro Valley or Marana because they take care of their roads. So he thinks it's going to become kind of a problem on who prioritizes the projects.
Speaking of confusion, Dylan, we've just brought up 2 different kinds of property tax increases. Will you clarify what were the distinction here?
Well, there's the primary property tax, which is basically what funds the county's general fund, and then bonding on top of that, sort of paid out of another set of property taxes over a long term to basically pay off a loan. So you've got your ongoing annual expenses, and then the things that you're trying to invest in that you float a bond for and then pay back.
And those ongoing annual expenses are what you just discussed when you talked about the county budget being
Yes.
potentially a $50 an increase,
Yeah.
$50 a year increase for property taxes. Then we have the bond program that voters may or may not approve, however much of it they do or do not approve. That's more on top of that. So lots of property tax discussions here. I just wanted to clarify what the difference was. And Zach, you covered a story that has got you out of the building a little more than some of the rest of us this week. You looked at preparations for fire season. What did you find and where did you go?
I was out at a bit past Reddington Pass, kind of on the backside of the Santa Catalina Mountains, where they're performing a 4,600 acre controlled burn. The Forest Service was out there performing this burn, and really kind of led me to learn a bit about how dry the conditions were. And you could really see, boy, it just takes those guys touching off a flame a little bit to get an area going. It was really interesting to get up that close and see, this area is pretty dry. And they were even saying they had to bump back the burn a day because the conditions initially were still a little moist from that weekend storm that moved through. It dropped about a ½ inch of rain in that area. And so if that's what's considered moist conditions, you kind of get an idea of how perilous the upcoming fire season could be. Now, just the other day, I was speaking with Rich Naden, who's a fire meteorologist, and he was saying, well, there has been one benefit, those little storms like what we saw last weekend, like what might be coming at the front end of next week. Those are at least slowing the start of the season. We may only get 6 to 8 weeks of the really severe conditions, which could be a good thing when things are as dry as they are. If we get just this, if we can narrow that window a little bit, it could help prevent some major fires.
So would the sort of the tail end of fire season be when the monsoon moves in and we start to dampen things down a little bit more?
Yeah, and that even kind of depends on how the monsoon rolls in. I remember last year when I went and spoke with Mac Tippins, who is the lookout up on Lemon Rock and Mount Lemon. He said, it always depends on, do we get a big spectacular lightning start to the season, or do we get a lot of moisture? Things can get really dangerous if it is a dry lightning start to the season, because that's just that much more chance for fires to get sparked off. But if it rolls in with a little moisture, it can actually kind of put an end to the season a little earlier like it did last year.
I'm going to switch back to Oro Valley and back to you, Thelma, and completely switch topics back to elections. We're jumping around a little bit, but this week we saw in Oro Valley news that the people who are trying to recall some Oro Valley council members have made some progress. What happened this week?
So there's a group out there, Oro Valley Citizens for Open Government. They pulled recall petitions for 4 council members, Mayor Satish Hiremath, Vice Mayor Lou Waters, and then council members Joe Hornat, Mary Snyder. This week they turned in petitions for 3 members, not Mayor Hiremath. They needed to collect about 2,100. They got about 3,000 for each. So now Julie Ballard, the town clerk, has 10 days to go through those petitions. Then she turns them over to PIMA County election officials, who have 60 days to go over to verify it.
So it could be a few months before we know whether this actually makes it on the ballot. And then, as you said, the mayor, potential recall of the mayor is also a little outstanding in this time.
They're still collecting signatures, and they still have some time. They haven't reached that deadline yet. So for him, they have to collect 2,700.
Is this mostly sparked by the Elcon purchase, or are there other things that people are basing their dislike of these?
There's some tax. There's some talk. There was some tax increases that they're adding into the discussion, but it is honestly the El Conquistador purchase, which I will stress they signed the deal this week on that. So even though the deal's still going through, it is because of that deal.
I talked with Lou Waters a little bit about that this week, and he says he sort of chalked it up to what he called growing pains for the town, that they're trying to, become more of a town in their own right and less of just an area outside of Tucson. Are people who live in the Northwest, in Marana and Oro Valley, are they starting to think of themselves more as residents of those communities rather than people who live on the outskirts of Tucson?
I think that's actually a really good point. You talked to Mayor Honey in Marana, and he said, when we were talking about the bond, he brought up what they have their own mall. They took over their wastewater operations. They're having some more developments come in. They're even looking at hotels coming in the area. So I think that's accurate. That both
a different sort of community identity.
They both want to stand on their own, and they're working toward that.
And earlier in the week when I spoke with Ryan Hartung, who's the head of the Oro Valley Citizens for Open Government, he said a big part of this for them was the fact that they felt like this whole process was kind of jammed through real quickly. And when I spoke with Mayor Hiremath earlier, he said, some of it had to be kept kind of secretive to start because it is a business decision, and there are people who don't want that information out there that, they're trying to sell property. So there was kind of that whole battle, but this was really a matter where it was mentioned for the first time at a public meeting, 1 week, and then 2 weeks later it was voted on. That is a big reason for the objection, is that the public comment period came after basically the initial agreement to purchase.
And Zach, if these signatures for the recall actually are all valid and make it to the ballot, when would Oro Valley voters be considering recalling some of their council members?
Harton told me that they really want this on the November ballot that is coming up. That's kind of their deadline for getting the signatures in for Mayor Hiremath, and they've already gotten these signatures in, so that there is plenty of leeway time. That is their hoped for date to get on the main election.
And then one last question, what the deadline is for those mayoral signatures. Thelma, do you know that?
I'm not sure. I think it's coming up in June.
Yeah,
June.
To get so by June all the signatures are due, then all of the checking, validating of those signatures, and then potentially November ballot.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
All right, well, we'll keep up on that as the season continues. Thank you all for coming in today. Before we go, we want to remind you that you can find all the stories we produce at Arizona Public Media on our website. We're also launching a new project called Favorite Places, and you can submit photos of your favorites online and through social media. Next, Arizona Week looks at Governor Doug Ducey's first few months in office.